"You're on Station 3, the maitre d' said, sliding the clipboard toward me like it was a verdict. "Keep the flutes steady." I smiled because that was the thing I knew how to do. I smiled until my cheeks ached, until the muscles in my jaw felt like they belonged to someone else. The tray hummed under my palm. The chandeliers above the ballroom threw a summer of light across faces that had never learned what it meant to be kind without a ledger attached. Then a man walked through the doors. Men in black moved with him, like shadows in formation. The room inhaled, and the air around him became a small storm. He was taller than I remembered, lean as an accusation, and when his eyes found mine there was a strange old gravity that pulled at my ribs like a tide. "Elias," I mouthed without meaning to. My voice felt like a borrowed thing, and I didn't want to give him the few pieces of me I still kept private. He wasn't supposed to be here. He certainly wasn't supposed to be standing beside the president. Yet there he was, as uncluttered as truth. Isla Pembroke smiled down at me from the stage and called my name as if she intended kindness. The microphone hummed. "Would you join me?" she asked, arm around my shoulders like she had the right to claim me on anyone's behalf. I stepped forward with a tray of glasses because, by the rules of the room, that is what I did when someone else wrote the script. I stepped up because the lessons of a childhood spent peeking from doorways will teach you how to move when everyone else is watching. But I did not expect him to do what he did next. Elias took the microphone, and his voice moved through the room the way light moves through a curtain. He said my name, and the way he said it made the chandeliers look like they were leaning closer to hear. He made a choice that split the night in two. He said what a man in his position rarely says in front of a room full of polite benefactors. "This is her," he said. "She is the reason we are having this conversation." I dropped the tray. Glass fell like an indictment. The sound of it broke something in the air and broke something inside me too. I ran, and the world became the white noise of heels and laughter and the cold press of air outside. The parking lot swallowed me until the concrete felt like something I could lean on, something steady and unambiguous. I pressed my hands to my ribs and tried not to breathe the way the panic asked me to. I tasted lemon oil and champagne and my own fear. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel, and that was where part one of the story ends tonight, because stepping into the light is harder than anyone ever tells you. This is the story of how a girl who learned how to fold herself into silence found the courage to press record. It is the story of a secret in an attic, a letter that changed hands like a key, and a pregnancy that arrived like a tiny, stubborn future. This is the story of how a man who once held an ordinary heart went on to build extraordinary power, and how power is useless without the consent of the one you love. In the next hour, you will follow me through the slow unspooling of belonging and through the loud, public truth that finally made a family choose differently. But first, you need to understand where I came from. You can learn to fit almost anything into silence. When you are 7 and the house you have lived in for a month still smells like packing tape and the paint isn't quite dry, you learn to keep your voice small. You tuck your questions into the pockets of your jeans. You let other people tell stories about you, and you keep the good parts to yourself. Heloise Pembroke kissed my forehead with fingers that smelled like chamomile and said the words that wrapped around my heart and kept me warm all the years before they unstitched me. "I wanted you," she said. "I wanted you before I could say it." That is how families can be both love and a ledger. Heloise kept me in an honest part of her heart. The rest of the house kept me like an exhibit, admired at parties, mentioned in charitable speeches, never quite invited into the plans that mattered. The girls, Isla and June, learned to be polished and precise. My stepfather, Mark Pembroke, learned how to make generosity a tax return and compassion a photo op. The early years are a patchwork of small kindnesses and larger silences. Heloise read to me on the couch until I had memorized whole paragraphs of books the way some people memorize prayers. She braided my hair the way only someone who loved someone else fully can braid hair. Slower, patient, precise. She celebrated my school ribbons and pinned them on her lapel as if they were pieces of her own history. But there were tutored smiles and chairs set just out of reach when the house filled with people whose politics were polished and whose loyalty had clauses. I wanted to believe that when love spoke my name it was the final word. When Heloise died, the world rearranged itself into a ledger. The will reading was a lesson in civility and the cruelty of procedure. There was the measured sympathy, the polite gazes, and then the documents. Mark handed me a folder like a verdict. "It's a complication," he said. The word was soft and meant to remove ownership. "We thought it would be sorted later. These things happen." They mean it to sound bureaucratic and small, but they are enormous. The house was theirs now. The artworks, the accounts, the memorials, everything was rearranged so their grief could become an asset rather than an obligation. My name persisted, written on school forms and on files, but legally I had been a foster placement with intention to adopt. The final decree had never been processed. They had kept that option to themselves for 15 years like a safety valve. I packed in a week. I learned the arithmetic of heartbreak quickly. Textbooks, a box of photographs, Heloise's letters. The attic held a wooden box with the inclinations of our private history. Heloise had kept every card I had written. She had kept the doodles and the badly spelled notes that declared my love in childish declarations. At the bottom of the box, there was one sealed envelope in her handwriting. "If you find this, I hope you'll know how much you were wanted," she had written on the outside. Inside were the names of a bank, an account number, and the hiding place of a key. There was also a brief, bracing sentence. "You are hers in the only way that always matters." For the first time, my hands stopped shaking because I understood that I had choices. What a strange and terrible thing to be given choice after you have spent so long trying to earn the right to keep the air. I used the money as a hinge rather than a weapon. I took an apartment small enough that I could clean it in an hour and big enough that the light fell across the floor the way it does in older houses. I started with small acts of dignity. I bought curtains that matched and a kettle that did not leak. I took a job at a non-profit legal clinic because the work felt like using the marrow of my life for something that mattered. I had been a subject in other people's stories for so long. Now I would be an advocate for families who could not afford justice. There is a certain solitude to rebuilding on your own terms. It is quiet and it can be tender. Weeks folded into months. I learned to file court documents with hands that had once held other people's champagne flutes. I learned to talk to clients, teens and mothers and people whose lives were messy in ways the Marlboro set did not understand, with a precise industry of care. When you spend your days translating heartbreak into statutes, you learn both the limits and the reach of law. Then, the small presence of a future arrived like spring in an unexpected crack. It was not dramatic. It was a bruise of nausea on a Tuesday and a bright, private math, 2 lines instead of 1. I kept that number soft and small. I told myself I could manage. The money Heloise had left was a bed that would keep me steady if I chose to build a life for a child. I would not be beholden. I would not be bought. I would be a parent on my terms. The clinic needed funds. The Pembroke Foundation, ironically named and beautifully photographed, continued to be a brand in the region. They sponsored panels and took medals and won awards for their dedication to children. They stitched Heloise's words into their pamphlets and built their reputation on a carousel of photographs. When Janet asked me to represent our clinic at the Pembroke Foundation's annual gala, I said yes because the money would mean lawyers and warm food and the difference between a family staying together and falling apart in juvenile court. I rehearsed my talking points the way soldiers rehearse survival. I practiced leaning into the room with a voice that measured anger into argument and anger into truth when it mattered. I anticipated questions. I learned the names of the donors who mattered and the missions they claimed to love. I did not anticipate their cruelty. They are small when they are cruel because cruelty is a kind of petty currency. Isla Pembroke arranged things with the kind of precision that keeps people behaving the way you want them to behave. She is a woman who will outsource warmth when it suits a campaign. That night she wrote a note to the maitre d', a note that was a valve to move a person from podium to prop. When I stepped into the ballroom, carrying my materials, they handed me an apron like a brand. The catering manager mistook me for a server. I laughed on the inside and breathed slowly on the outside. We are taught to be grateful. Charity is something they can put in a photograph and hand to a benefactor. Isla went on stage in a dress that cost a month of my rent and spoke about stewardship. Her smile was the sort that has been practiced in front of mirrors. We love to see the people our grants help, she told the room. We love to show how our money turns lives around. She scanned the crowd and found me in the pool of light like someone selecting a model for their exhibit. Will you join me? She asked, and the microphone made my voice sound like a small, accidental thing. I walked because I had been walking for 15 years, moving where others told me to move, speaking when someone pressed me into a script. She took the microphone and set it toward me with the practiced tenderness of someone who loves the image of kindness more than the practice of it. She placed a glass in my hand like an offering, and the room applauded politely. I felt like an animal that had been taught to perform. The applause tasted like pennies. Then the room changed. He moved in not like a spectacle but like a certainty. Elias stepped in as if the world had been waiting on him to come back. He wore his importance with a quiet that was entirely his. The crowd shifted to find him like weather responding to a pressure system. He took the microphone from Mark Pembroke with the kind of authority that people buy with time and decisions. He spoke about responsibility as if responsibility had been an ingredient in his breakfast. He looked at me like a man who had spent his life cataloging small truths and finally found one that was his to protect. "This is the woman I have been trying to find," he said. The sentence was a soft detonator. My mouth made the sound of surprise and then the alarm of panic. The air reconverged on me like magnets. And because the world loves symmetry, Isla decided to make me a tableau, a success story, a proof of philanthropy. She stepped close and put an arm around me like she owned the space my body used to occupy. "Tell them about your work," she said, smiling in the way rich women smile when they want proof that their charity is efficient. Amara. The name felt like a thing someone else had given me, but also like a thing I had kept in secret. All of the small rehearsed scripts of my life straightened into one public walk. The room's eyes were soft and cruel at once. I was on the stage with an apron tied around my waist. I had been presented as a living exhibit. A woman in a silk dress had just announced to 200 people that my life was a story they could use to make themselves look good. I felt every muscle in my body respond like a violin string. Elias's gaze reached for me across the crowd, and in it I read a calendar of months he had spent looking. His face was everything that used to fit my hands, and then did not. He seemed to have made himself into a thing that could cross oceans and sign papers and hold power, and all of it had come from the patient labor of time. Yet he looked at me with the same particular tenderness he had when we were younger, and for a moment I felt very small and very luminous, and all at once I could not tell which was which. Isla's smile faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat when he walked toward the stage. She is someone who understands optics. She knows how to salvage a photograph. Her hand tightened where she steadied me. "We love showing what our philanthropy can do," she said, softer now. "We love seeing a full life." Elias took the mic. "I'm Elias Rowan," he said, and his voice carried like an instrument. "I run Rowan International. I've been working with agencies to ensure transparency in charitable giving. Tonight I want to acknowledge the work of local clinics like Amara's." The room hummed differently. A man with that name and that presence can make people listen. He looked at me and said something that the room would quote later as a line of charity and sincerity. "Sometimes the most important work is not the money we give, but the attention we pay to the truth of the people we aim to help." And then humanity intervened in a way that is almost holy. He stepped down from the podium and faced me. The sound in the ballroom became smaller and closer. He said my name and described not my place in someone else's narrative, but the reality of my work. He used a word I had not expected to hear in a room full of donations and dented silverware. He used a word that is small and dangerous. "She is the reason we are here," he said. The chandeliers bent toward the sentence. The tray slipped from my hands. Glass collided with marble in a sound that cut the room like an accusation. I saw the flash of someone's phone. I saw people recoil with that curious shame that visitors feel when they watch something messy happen at a dinner party. I heard Isla's voice curdle into a command I did not have time to decode. The humiliation is not only in the breaking of plates. It is in being turned into an object when you are still a living, flawed person. I ran because the panic was no longer a small animal caged inside me. It was a tidal thing. I ran through the back doors and out into the parking lot, and the cool night air hit my face with a clarity that felt like a promise or a threat. My hands found my ribs, and I pressed them as if I could keep the world from shaking my bones. Heloise's Corolla, my small, stubborn talisman, was there like a honest object in a world of performances. I leaned against its hood and let the panic have the loud, naked hour it needed. I could hear the chatter of voices continuing inside the ballroom like a television in another room. In there, stories were being redone and the photograph would be set as if the crisis never happened. It is a curious thing to be the center of attention in two worlds at once. The room that sees you as evidence and the lot that knows you as breath and blood. I pressed my fist into my palm because the body knows how to hold itself together even when the mind is a series of small collapses. A figure approached on the gravel. Footsteps were careful and not many. He stopped a few paces away, and I could see the outline of him in the lamplight. "Amara," he said softly, "please don't run." The sentence should have been the end of the hour and the beginning of a long piece. Instead it became the hinge. He had been away in the rooms where decisions are made. He had built something people admired and feared. He had been patient in a way that finances cannot buy. He had come to the place where the family of my childhood had cast me out, and in the simplest way he could, he had stepped into the wreckage in order to offer something like steady company. If the first part of our life is taught by the people who fail us, the second part is the one we decide to build by the help and authority we accept. He stepped closer, and the shadow dissolved into the shape of a man who had loved me once without the centrifugal flare of status. He had traded the library lamp for a boardroom lamp, and he had kept his hands able to hold small things. "Why did you leave?" he asked, quiet and direct. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice had the quality of someone who kept inventories and found discrepancies. For a moment I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to tell him about the attic and the wooden box and Heloise's letter. I wanted to tell him about the way Isla had stepped into our lives like a policy and turned intimacy into a problem to be managed. I wanted to tell him about the text I had written as a young sadness, a message that became a wound to which he had never found the map. I wanted to hold every small truth in my hand and show it to him and have him understand. Instead I pushed away the mop of shame in my throat and said, "I can't be a thing anyone lifts. Not like that. Not in front of them." He looked at me with a tenderness that had been tempered by time. "I wasn't trying to lift you," he said. "I wanted to find you. I wanted to know if you were okay." "I am pregnant," I blurted then, as if confession could make me less fragile or more real. The sentence was small and enormous in the same breath. His face moved like the weather. There was surprise and then a softening. He reached for my hand, and when it touched mine, something untied inside my chest. "I want to be with you," he said. He did not offer to buy my future. He did not promise to make pain disappear. He only said the thing I needed most: "I want to be with you." And then, because life will not arrange its acts purely for the movie, voices approached from the building. Isla and June's high, managed tones, Mark's measured indignation. Their faces were white with the sort of fury made of shock and threatened pride. It was the sound a lion makes when it sees territory being claimed. "You have caused quite a scene," Isla said like an accusation wrapped in silk. Her words were sharp and rehearsed. "You should leave before. Daniel, you cut off." Her sentence died when Elias stepped in front of me and refused to be moved. "You interfered with my relationship once," he said, with a kind of calm that comes before a storm. "You broke someone I loved by lying to him. You did not put it right." The line hangs there like a test. It is the moment when the person who loved you in youth turns into someone who has the means to challenge the structures that hurt you. The Pembrokes glared. They mouthed denials that used the language of decency. He did not shout. He did not roar. He put one sentence against their practiced civility, and that sentence was enough to begin a reckoning. I pulled back and found the part of me that had been taught to choose silence, and said in a voice I could feel like a new coin, "Stop. Let me speak." They all turned like a chorus trained to react. For the first time in my life I slammed a whole drawer of the past and reclaimed the kitchen. I told them then in the small, steady voice I had rehearsed in courtrooms and in cheap apartments what had happened to me. The final adoption that had never happened, the eviction, the wooden box, Heloise's key. I told them that for years they had treated me as a donation receipt and called it stewardship. As I spoke, midnight folded into morning around us, and the idea of being small dissolved in the way rain dissolves chalk. They flinched. The moment I had been waiting years to face arrived like a train at a station. But the train is slower than you imagine because other forces are moving. A camera flashed from inside the ballroom. Somewhere, someone had recorded the exchange, a small, ordinary act that will later prove the algebra of harm. I did what I had taught myself to do when my clients stood in court. I documented. I pressed the record button on my phone and let the Pembroke's words become evidence. There was a line in Isla's voice that will be played back and freeze them for what it is. "You were our project," she said in a tone of ownership. "You were our obligation. The rest of the night is for the next part." The immediate future in the parking lot was an act of catching breath and choices. Elias stood beside me while their voices ricocheted like trials they were losing. He did not promise me that he would destroy them. He promised me a presence. He promised to stay and to help me make certain the truth would not be swallowed by polite applause. I got in Heloise's Corolla and drove away with Elias following in a car that fit him like a second skin, the engine singing a duet of two people choosing a future together. Behind us the Pembroke house glowed like a stage prepared for a performance. In the rear-view mirror the chandeliers looked like stars. I exhaled and felt a small altar inside me rearrange its candles. But there are debts that cannot be paid with presence alone. There are structures of a kind that need more than truth. The recording in my phone was only a beginning. There would be lawyers and press and hearings and slow, dispassionate investigations. There would be late nights reading through ledgers and the precise, cold arithmetic of money disguised as charity. And there would be a baby who would need a room with a window and a book on the nightstand, and a person who would say, each night, "You belong." That, more than anything, would be the obligation I would keep, not to punish the men who had punished me, but to build a life in which small people would not learn to fold themselves into silence. I let the engine hum and watched the city unspool. Elias reached across and took my hand. His fingers fit mine the way they once had, the old map now housed in newer hands. He did not buy me. He did not rescue me with a spectacle. He simply held and let me choose. We drove away into a future that would be fought for and formed. We drove into a score of investigation and testimony and small legal victories. We drove into the part of the story that would not be told by those chandeliers and the hostess's smiles, but by quiet committees and a room full of lawyers who would learn how to translate cruelty into evidence. I pressed my head against the glass and let miles of light slide past like the pages of a book I could not yet read. The night had broken, and the only thing I was sure of was the small, astonishing fact that I no longer wanted to be a thing that other people polished and used. I wanted to be someone who could name her truth in a room full of people who had never bothered to listen. The morning after the banquet arrived like a noise you could not unhear. My phone buzzed with logic and indignation and journalistic cadence. My inbox filled with messages that ranged from tender concern to sharp curiosity. People I had never met wrote notes that felt like hands reaching through a window. There were questions, offers of legal help, and the kind of sorrow only strangers can give. The world that had been small and careful around me widened in a single quiet breath. Elias drove us to a coffee place with windows that caught morning like a promise. He parked and turned off the engine, and the silence between us was not empty. He said, "Tell me what you want me to do." The question could have been an offer of power, and it could have been a threat of smothering. I learned to ask for specifics. "Help me make sure this is about systems, not spectacle," I said. "Help the clinic get the funding we need without making this a show. Help me protect the kids who depend on us." He nodded like a man who liked to take orders because it meant he would later keep his promises to them. "We'll get lawyers, press advisors, forensic accountants," he said. "We'll let them find the truth." He spoke like a man who could buy a truth, and then, unexpectedly, he added, "But this will be slow. It will be methodical. Are you prepared for that?" I was. I had been ready for years without knowing it. I had rehearsed the language of courts and statutes in my head in the quiet hours. I had practiced the way to look at judges and not flinch. Now the practice was real, and I was trembling with the right kind of fear, the kind that sharpens instead of numbs. Elias introduced me to lawyers who did not speak in capital letters. They spoke in summons and schedules and timelines. They wanted to know everything. They wanted dates, transcripts, the attic key, the handwritten letter. They showed me how to turn shame into a document. They told me that evidence is a kind of love because it protects people who cannot protect themselves. We started small. We compiled the recordings I had made in the parking lot into a folder, cleaned the audio files, and time-stamped the cruelty. We made a list of names: support staff who could corroborate that I had been directed to change into a server's uniform, donors who remembered seeing me as a success story, neighbors who could testify about a family that curated its image more carefully than its children's welfare. We found Heloise's bank records, the safety deposit box evidence, which showed a discreet deposit that had been hidden from the Pembroke family's prying hands. We built the narrative the way you construct a house. Foundation first, then frame, then the proof that makes the building stand. The Pembrokes reacted the way people with a long practice in optics react. They released a short, savvy statement that bent words into plausible shapes. "We are shocked," Mark said in a filmed statement that had been drafted and perfected a dozen times. "We believe in transparency. We welcome any inquiry." Isla took to interviews with a kind of training that made her worry seem practiced and the tears as clean as costume changes. June posted a photograph of herself with a therapy dog. The public relations machine started to hum as if it were a separate animal with its own thirst. But the city is a collection of people who gossip and of journalists who can smell an unfinished story, and soon enough a reporter who had watched more than one scandal unfold came to the clinic. He was the sort of man who asked direct questions and pressed for timelines. I told him, in the clinic's back office where posters about custody rights fluttered, the outline of what had happened. I did not do it for drama. I did it because I knew the only tool shame cannot withstand is naming. He recorded our conversation and later ran a careful piece that did not attempt sensationalism. He explained the differences between staged generosity and true stewardship with the detached voice of someone who has watched both. Once the story was out, donors called. Some demanded refunds, embarrassed and startled. A few came to the clinic's door asking how their funds had been used and offering support for better auditing. The most interesting calls were from the people who had never been inside the Pembroke house but had given money because a familiar name made them feel safe. Those were the calls that made it possible to turn the scandal into a movement for accountability. The federal inquiry began as a ripple and then expanded into a wave. A government office with a name that sounded like a promise sent a polite but formal letter requesting records and offering a timetable for review. The Pembrokes, predictably, hired counsel that gloved itself in experience. Mark's face, which had been the color of practiced authority, shifted into the tired gray of a man who had been forced to consider contingency. The lines you do not imagine in people began to show. The first depositions were a strange kind of theater. We sat under white lights in conference rooms, and the questions were precise and stinging. Isla's answers were prepared in languages intended for cameras, but she could not fully control the infinitesimal shiver in her voice when pressed about who had access to certain ledgers. I sat across the table from her and wanted to say 1,000 small things, about braids and childhood dinners and the way Mark had taught me how to hold a glass without being noticed, but the lawyers told me to keep to the facts. Facts feel like a cool basin when the rest of life is a furnace. People sometimes imagine that justice is a single, righteous roar. The truth is that it is habitually slow and bureaucratic and made of forms and schedules. We sat through subpoenas and through the kind of meticulous accounting that was its own kind of intimacy. Elias's team found transfers that made no logical philanthropical sense. Payments to shell companies, invoices for events that had no traceable expense, and reports that claimed to benefit programs that did not exist. Watching the spreadsheets unspool felt like watching a magician's trick rewound into reveal. Yet the moral high ground brings its own dangers. As the Pembrokes were stripped of their polish in public view, they began to reach via a counterattack. Conspiracy theories bloomed in comment sections like weeds. Old acquaintances sent solicitous notes about the difficulty of public life. They mounted a legal campaign that included the usual threats: defamation suits and countersuits, requests to access private medical records, attempts to anchor me into a narrative of instability. There was a moment, in a quiet afternoon when the clinic phone had not yet rung off the hook, when I felt the old shame return in a triple knot. If I were not careful, the fear would learn my new address. Elias watched the way I navigated this like a man measuring how to offer a ladder without carrying me up. "You know they'll try to make this about you," he said one evening as we ate in the small kitchen of my apartment. His voice was gentle as if it were an old prescription. He had a habit of asking the sort of practical questions that rewired fear into strategy. "They'll attempt to weaponize your past. We need to prepare for that." I looked at him and saw something that had been forged in the quiet rooms of capital and time, a man who had learned the kinds of leverage that could unmake reputations. But I also saw something else, the thing men are not always taught to own, a patience to listen to what someone else needed without offering a purchase as answer. "We'll survive," I said. It was half prayer and half plan. What I had not anticipated was the human cost of litigation. The clinic's waiting room filled with people who had been summoned. Parents who had been given false hope and children whose records had been mishandled. For every ledger corrected, there was a story of a child who had been moved unnecessarily from one foster home to another, because money had been diverted. For every corrected spreadsheet, there were faces that had learned to distrust charity. My job, my purpose, began to feel like a callus on a hand that once had been raw. Sometimes, late at night, I found myself going through Heloise's letters and reading about small things she had said. She had loved me in ways that asked for nothing in return. That knowledge is not a protection from sorrow, but it is an anchor against it. Her letters kept me tethered to a softer truth. I read them and I thought about the baby moving lightly beneath my ribs. I felt a new sort of fury then, not the brittle anger that wants revenge, but the precise anger of someone who sees harm and refuses to let it be repeated. Elias was practical and inventive and sometimes maddeningly patient. He organized a small foundation of his own for transparency in nonprofit governance and funded a forensic accounting team dedicated to tracing charity funds. He met with senators and with whistleblowers. He introduced me to people who understood that zeal could be weaponized and who nonetheless wanted to help us set a precedent. He also was unflinchingly human when the cameras were not on. He made coffee wrong and left his collar unbuttoned and did things like pick up a book I had mentioned days earlier. Our life together found new rhythms. I worked during the day at the clinic, and at night we sat with files and phone calls and strategy sessions. We slept in small increments when the work demanded it. I learned how to let myself be supported without letting that support define me. We were partners in the only modern sense that matters. Chosen mutual labor. As the investigation widened, other voices stepped forward. Former employees of the Pembrokes who had been instructed to manage optics described an office culture where the appearance of generosity mattered more than the practice. An accountant who had worked on the Foundation's books for years agreed to examine data that revealed a pattern of creative accounting. A retired board member, uncomfortable with the direction the Foundation had taken after Heloise died, contacted us and provided minutes of meetings that read like an instruction manual on obfuscation. The more evidence we collected, the less plausible the Pembroke line about a few clerical errors became. The federal investigators were methodical and deliberate. They did not use the language of the Internet. They used subpoenas and interviews and a sober currency of documents. That steadiness felt like real justice even when the public wanted fireworks. The Pembrokes, sensing their empire of optics erode, adopted a posture of wounded dignity. Mark began to look smaller in his public statements. The power lines in his jaw softened into fatigue. Isla's speeches became tighter and more corporate. June retreated into a silence that was, in its own way, more eloquent than any statement. The house that had once been a stage for their warm self-congratulation shuffled into a different rhythm. Donors asked for audits, and the Foundation's bank accounts were frozen while the inquiry continued. But that did not end the harm. People who had relied on services that turned out to be paper-thin felt abandoned. Staff at the Foundation who had done honest work found themselves caught in the public crossfire. We tried to be careful in our prosecution of truth to avoid collateral damage. That care required more patience than cameras reward. Internally, I felt a tug that was not only professional. There were nights when memories of college with Elias performed like ghostly home movies. I remembered the library lights and the way our hands had brushed over papers as we argued about datasets and ethics. I remembered how small and bright he had made me feel. I remembered, most of all, how his face had been a map to an unspoken kind of steadiness when I had been small and unsure. The pregnancy became a quiet axis to our decisions. We went to doctor's appointments, and I told him about the tiny thumb suck I saw on an ultrasound blurred by motion. He sat in the waiting room as if he had always known he would be needed. There was an intimacy to those mundane acts that felt like the other kind of justice. The thing that builds life rather than dismantles it. There were also hard tests. The Pembrokes tried to use the court of public opinion to paint me as a woman who had sought attention, who had staged the event for sympathy. They dug into my past with the lazy cruelty of people who assumed that the mistakes of youth invalidate anyone. They pressured journalists to reveal clinical details about my life. They launched a counter-narrative seeded with half-truths and formatted for virality. It was the kind of attack that tries to strip the person from the story and leave the facts bleeding. I felt the pull of old survival tactics. Shrink, apologize, explain. Instead, I learned to be precise. I learned to speak in simple sentences that did not give them space to twist my actions. I learned to let others do the heavy lifting of litigation while I focused on the human work that mattered. The clients who came for help, the families who needed counsel, the children who asked for bedtime stories. As the days unfolded, there was a moment that felt like a pivot. The federal inquiry had gathered enough preliminary evidence to trigger a formal hearing. The media called it a hearing into nonprofit governance and charity fraud. Worse, the Pembrokes were starting to make the accusation that our recordings were taken out of context. They were trying to make the moral arithmetic confusing. If we have context and you present the right parts, anyone can be made to look like a villain. It was the classic defense. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday in a municipal building that smelled of polished wood and old coffee. The room was designed for testimony and for slow governmental patience. When I walked into it, I felt something familiar and new at once. I had practiced standing in rooms like this at the clinic, advocating for people who did not have the vocabulary of law. Today, I would be both advocate and witness. Elias came with me and sat in the gallery, but he left the cross-examination to lawyers. He had learned enough to trust legal processes. He had also learned to keep his hands steady because there is a peculiar violence in the way power can make people feel like they are spectacles. We had practiced the points we needed to make. We had rehearsed the chronology. We had adjusted for the kinds of questions that lawyers ask to distract witnesses. It felt strange and profoundly necessary to own the facts on the stand. I took the stand and the room narrowed like breath. The hearing is the place where small words become judicial tools. I spoke about Heloise's letters and the deposit box, about the eviction and the legal limbo. I described the gala and the sequence that had led to my leaving the Pembroke house. I held to the facts the way a musician holds a note. Lawyers with the Pembroke name tried to frame me as unstable and needy, but the documentation we had built, bank records, recorded statements, corroborating witnesses, was careful and solid. Evidence is a kind of humility. It asks nothing of the soul beyond the truth. When the recorded clip from the parking lot played in the hearing room, there was a collective inhalation. The silence felt like a physical thing, heavy and charged. The prosecutor asked the room to consider the difference between charity performed for cameras and charity that is honest in its accounting. The Pembroke lawyer attempted to pivot, but the chain of emails and transfers we had built made the pivot awkward. Outside the courthouse there were protesters. People from both sides had their signs and their politely delivered opinions. I saw a few faces that had given to the Pembroke Foundation, who now felt constructed and betrayed. I also saw people who had been waiting for some kind of accountability in the nonprofit sector. It was, in its messy way, a civic moment. After the hearing, the federal office announced it would pursue a more extensive audit. The Pembroke's bank accounts were under scrutiny. The cameras followed us like a tide. My face was in the news. I felt a small and strange victory even though it was wrapped in complexity. Complex because the law is not a guillotine but a patient, sometimes shattering instrument of change. That night, as the city dimmed and the clinic's lights went low, Elias and I sat on my couch with files and takeout and the kind of quiet that only work yields. I was exhausted in a way that was not purely physical. It was the exhaustion of someone who has named a wrong and is now paying attention to the long, meticulous work of making the name stick. He reached across and touched the place on my belly where the child was growing. "We will be careful," he said. "We will be persistent." I nodded. There was still a long road ahead. There would be motions, encounters, and weeks that smelled like old coffee and municipal tape. There would be testimony from people who might fear speaking because the Pembrokes had money and reach. There would be private threats and small acts of cruelty that lawyers cannot always stop. There would also be small triumphs. A donor who insisted on returning support directly to honest programs, a volunteer who found renewed faith in advocacy, a child whose case we stabilized because we had the funds to do so. In the quiet, I thought of Heloise's letter and the way it described me as chosen. Choice is at the heart of the life I wanted to build. That fact, simple and stubborn, would stitch the nights ahead. The hearing had not ended the threat. If anything, it had marked our transition from private injury to public cause. And when private injury becomes public cause, the stakes are, without exaggeration, the shape of other people's lives. There were nights I woke up in the dark and felt like a child again. The old script, shrink, apologize, vanish, still tried to nudge me. But the new script had different rhythms. It asked that I be precise and honest and vulnerable in ways that were not self-destructive. It asked me to be fierce and compassionate in equal measure. We prepared for what would come next. There would be further hearings, and a slow unspooling of the Pembrokes' financial statements that would take months. There would be angry columns and sad editorials. There would be a difficult civic conversation about how donors vet charities and how the work of protecting vulnerable children can be shielded from the polished machinery of social theater. And because life insists on continuing, there were other intimacies. Elias and I went to a small shop and bought a tiny blanket, the kind that smells like wool and possibility. We set it aside in a drawer, not as proof but as quiet commitment. I cooked simple meals when I had time. I read legislation like a liturgy. I learned that love in this phase of life was often a function of small, unwavering acts. Making coffee for someone who has not slept, answering an email for a volunteer whose fear needs a steady hand, listening to a child who needs a bedtime story. As the investigation unfolded, I could feel the city changing in small ways. People who had been used to buying virtue with their donations began to ask harder questions. The local philanthropic scene, for a season, found its conscience sharpened. People called for clearer oversight and better auditing. When systems care, they are more likely to protect the small people. That was the victory that made the long nights worth it. But the story was not closed. The Pembrokes were not yet finished. They had lawyers and soldiers of spin. They pushed back in the subtle ways that the wealthy do. There was intimidation. There was an attempt to subpoena the clinic's client list in hopes of discovering a way to paint us as improvised and untrustworthy. There was a moment when an anonymous tip leaked a photograph from my childhood to a tabloid. It felt like a small old wound reopened. We were prepared. We had built evidence and allies. We had made our case with the sober instruments of law. Yet what I had not expected was the way public curiosity begins to shape even honest lives. There were nights when I worried less about the Pembrokes and more about the children who would have to navigate the aftermath of a foundation's collapse. That concern, more than anything, kept me steady. So we leaned into the work. We set up a fund for children who would be affected by the fallout. We strengthened the clinic's intake and counseling. We started, in quiet measures, the beginnings of structural change that would not rely on celebrity or spectacle. Those acts are not grand, but they are necessary. And the personal life, fragile and stubborn, continued to unfurl. Elias held my hand in courtrooms and in kitchens, and he learned, with a strange humility, how to shelter without commandeering. He did not buy the story for me. He stood beside me and allowed me to hold my own voice. When I was ready to testify at a federal hearing, he was there in the gallery, his presence a reminder that love could be partnership and not patronage. We learned that truth can be loud and gentle at the same time. We learned that there would be no cinematic end with confetti and songs. The historian's work was slow and unglamorous, and yet it altered lives. It made it harder for people with pedigrees and polished speeches to hide behind their smiles. It forced systems to answer to facts. Ahead, the calendar showed more hearings. The prosecutors hinted at charges that would make the Foundation's leadership face hard questions. The city had begun, at last, to tighten audits for certain non-profit categories. The clinic's phone kept ringing. The baby continued to move inside me like a small, stubborn drumbeat. There would be pain. There would be setbacks. There would be days when the legal correspondence felt like a tide that drags everything toward exhaustion. But there would also be days when a donor called to ask how they could better vet their giving and stayed on the line while I explained the steps. There would be quiet victories, like the case where we stopped the erroneous transfer of a child between homes because we could prove the payees were shells. The hearing scheduled for the next month would be the first place where they would try to undermine everything with character attacks and attempts to recast the narrative. I knew what was at stake not only for me, but for the children who might still be failed by cleverly worded forms. I also knew that the law, when wielded with care, could protect more lives than mere revenge ever could. On a late October morning, as the trees turned in slow, deliberate fire, I filed a motion with the prosecutor's office asking for an expedited review of several suspicious transfers. It felt like lighting a candle in a cathedral. Elias smiled at me and said, "You're ready." I did not always feel ready. But that day, in a small act that was not a triumph and not a tragedy, I realized that I had begun to become someone who could hold both pain and purpose. The child inside me kicked as if in agreement, and I laughed softly, a sound that was both prayer and promise. There are no tidy endings in the middle of a trial. There is process and patience and the slow accrual of truth. The next part of the story would be the public reckoning, the hearings where character would be probed and where the Pembroke's comfort would be stripped away in public light. It would be noisy and shocking and humanly complicated. For now, we prepared. We collected witnesses, checked facts, soothed frightened volunteers, and tried to imagine the small life we were making for a child who did not yet have a name. I taped a small blanket into a drawer and practiced breathing in measured ways. The city turned and the calendar of hearings advanced. The legal machines hummed patiently. I learned to sleep in short, steady segments. I learned to read deposition transcripts like a catechism. I learned that the question, "What do you want?" can be answered in very small and very dangerous ways. At the end of that week, Elias asked me to take a walk with him along the river. The air had been cleared by rain, and the river itself moved in a steady, indifferent line. We walked in silence for a long time, and when we stopped, he reached and took my hand. He did not say anything that illuminated a grand future. He only said, "Whatever comes next, we face it together." I felt the truth of that and the fragility of the vow. The hearings would come. The cameras would follow. The preachings of donors and the murmurs of politicians would try to shape what the city thought. But under it all, life would continue in small acts. The making of a cup of tea, the folding of a blanket, the telling of a story to a child who might one day ask where she came from. We were not saved. We were not sanctified. We were, in the stubbornest sense, continuing. And that continuation, more than anything, would define the part of our lives that had been placed in motion that night when chandeliers leaned and a man in a black suit stepped back into a room and said my name. The morning of the final hearing arrived with a weathered calm. The sky was a steady, honest gray, as though the day itself wanted nothing theatrical. Reporters clustered like small islands near the courthouse steps. Cameras waited with the patient boredom of people who expected drama. I felt a quiet tension in my ribs the way runners feel a small pressing before a race. I was not naive enough to expect a tidy ending. Justice is rarely tidy. It is slow, meticulous, and insists on proof. The hearing room filled with people who had a stake in truth and people who feared it. Families who had been helped by the clinic sat in the gallery beside students who had come to watch a civic moment unfold. Volunteers who had worked with us whispered greetings and handed me small notes of support. Elias sat with his hands folded, his suit untidy in the good way of someone who had stopped polishing life for cameras and started living in it. He looked tired, with a softness around the eyes that said he had been carrying more than legal documents. When the prosecutor began to lay out the case, it read like the reverse of a magic trick. Transfers were traced with elegant cruelty. Money that should have fed classrooms and counseling sessions had been siphoned to shell accounts. Documents that boasted of programs were thin as air when checked against invoices. The evidence did not scream. It sat on the table and let the room do its own accounting. It is strange how slowly arrogance unravels when someone else is patient. Mark Pembroke's speeches about philanthropic duty began to sound like the rehearsed liturgy they were. Isla's smile, once bright and chiseled by image consultants, became a study in how practice can only replicate certain feelings. She answered questions in clipped tones, and for the first time the audience could hear the strain beneath the practiced cadence. We had brought witnesses who had worked behind the scenes, an accountant with a conscience, a former grant manager who had been pushed out after questioning certain invoices, an assistant who had been directed to produce glossy reports for donors without any of the substance to back them up. Their testimonies were quiet and precise. They described meetings and memos and the way polite language had been used as cover for risk. When my turn came to speak, I stood and felt the moment fold into a smaller, human shape. I told the hearing about Heloise and the way she marked my birthday with a call and the way she asked questions about my day in a voice that made me feel seen. I told them about the attic box and the key and the seed money Heloise had left so I would never be dependent on the kindness of those who saw charity as performance. I did not try to be poetic. I tried, instead, to be exact. I read from documents that showed a pattern of diversion, and I described the effect those diversions had had on people who trusted the Foundation's glossy brochures. I spoke, too, about the clinic and its clients, about the families who had lost time and resources because funds were rerouted to pay for galas and vanity campaigns. The room listened. You could feel it in the pause after certain sentences, in the way people leaned forward as if to catch the small, human evidence of harm. When a clip from my parking lot recording was played, the hush that followed was a near-physical thing, like heat withdrawing from a room. Mark Pembroke's voice, captured in an ordinary, everyday way, had weight now. The words that once hid behind charm now bore a clarity that made them dangerous in their ordinariness. Outside the courthouse, the world began to rearrange itself. Donors who had been hoping for small comforts and tidy press photos found their name associated with that unglamorous word, fraud. They called their advisors. Foundations reviewed their vetting processes. People who had given because a familiar name felt safe now began to ask hard, inconvenient questions about where their money had gone. The prosecution moved through the evidence like a slow, patient surgeon. Documents were produced. Emails were read into the record. Bank transfers were traced across international lines until the paper trail was as tight as a piece of wire. When the auditors testified about anomalies, the sound in the room was not triumphant. It was weary and careful and more profound than any applause. There were moments that felt almost human in the middle of legal procedure. An aide who had worked quietly for the Pembrokes for years swallowed several times before testifying. "We were told to prioritize optics," she said, voice small but steady. "We were told to make sure events looked like impact. We were never told to ask where the money was actually going." The sentence landed like a small trumpet. It was not theatrical, only true. When the court adjourned for the day, there was still legal work to do, still counters and defenses. The legal system is not a spectacle but an instrument. Even when it is wielded, consequences take time. But the hearing had shifted public perception. People began to see the difference between the language of charity and the practice of care. That difference, once visible, does not always heal quickly. It does, however, force infrastructure to change. In the weeks that followed, press inquiries multiplied and the forensic audits widened. I learned, in a slow and sometimes terrifying way, how money can be made to do harm when fraud is involved. I learned how it takes careful people in the right seats to stop that harm. Elias continued to be a steady presence. He did not try to close the case with money. He continued instead to deploy resources in a disciplined way. Legal teams, investigator trust funds, and initiatives to help clinics and donors adopt better due diligence. We also focused on sheltering those who might be harmed by the fallout. The clinic established an emergency fund to hold funds in escrow for programs that had been legitimately operating but found themselves exposed by association. We worked with other nonprofits to advise them on governance. We offered workshops on auditing and donor vetting. We did not shout from rooftops. We did the steady, prosaic work of building systems that make it harder for abuse to hide. The Pembrokes were placed under a legal microscope. Evidence accumulated until it resembled a kind of ledger of omission and misdirection. Charges were eventually filed. The media circled with the intensity of a town watching its high priests fall from grace. But the most meaningful changes were quieter. Policy shifts in local nonprofit boards, donors who required independent audits, and an increased public scrutiny that made social theater more costly and less tempting. And then, when a headline screamed the news of preliminary indictments, I felt a strange, complex wash of emotions that were not joy nor vengeance, but something calmer. There is an unpleasant pleasure in seeing a fraud exposed, yes, but it is not the kind of pleasure that makes a life. What I felt instead was relief. Relief that the long work of collecting evidence and protecting others had not been wasted. Relief that systems would be more careful because someone had been brave enough to say the truth. In the midst of all of this, the pregnancy continued like a quiet drumbeat. The child inside me did not care for legal work or public glory. The body grows in a slow, sovereign way. The doctor assured us, with the direct kindness of someone who measures the world by vitals and not headlines, that the baby was strong. Elias and I went to appointments and read names and argued over the right syllable. We promised the child a life that would not be measured by the shadows of other people's mistakes. There were private reckonings as well. Mark Pembroke begged, through lawyers, for mercy and for dismissal. Isla tried to make media appearances that hinted at regret. The courtroom, for all its formality, is also where people can witness remorse in slow motion. Remorse does not undo harm, but it can sometimes unbend a heart enough to make restitution possible. There was, inevitably, a low moment when I doubted whether the work would be enough or whether the sacrifices would be worth the exhaustion. The Pembrokes' countersuits tried to make the story about me. They subpoenaed friends and acquaintances, asking for small things that might be twisted. They tried to weaponize gossip and to recast a tale of organized fraud into one long, confusing drama about human foibles. During those nights, I would fall into Heloise's letters. I learned how she wrote the way trees bend in a storm, steady and generous. Her handwriting traveled into my chest and smoothed my breath. I would read and sometimes sleep with a letter under my pillow like a talisman. Those letters carried a quiet dignity that became armor against small cruelties. The legal work wore on. Some hearings concluded with charges and plea deals that returned money and dissolved entities. Other aspects moved into civil suits that took months. The press flavor changed from shock to detailed analysis. People had the space to consider policy and to ask how charity could have been made more accountable. The city slowly rewired itself in response. The single most significant change to me was not the downfall of a family but the policies that were enacted to ensure that the specific harms we had documented were less likely to recur. New rules for non-profit audits were put into practice. Donors began requiring independent proof of programmatic work before approving large sums. Foundations established panels to include more community voices and fewer cosmetic experts who advised on optics rather than outcomes. Those were small systemic changes, but they were meaningful and durable. In that season, I also found myself deeply committed to one small, radiant ambition: to make sure children who are adopted or in foster care find not performative families but real, steady love. The clinic expanded its representation in adoption law. We launched a program of counseling for adoptive families and for those whose placements had been disrupted by poor oversight. I testified before legislative committees and wrote policy briefs. These acts were not glamorous, but they felt like mending. One winter evening, when the city was dressed in a pale quiet and snow had softened the edges of passing cars, Elias and I took a walk with a small blanket folded in his coat pocket. We bought a nursery chair and lined up a few books. The house we had chosen was not a mansion. It was a pale, sturdy house with a garden and a front porch where the children could scream to no one's annoyance. It had shelves the right height for small hands. When our child was born, the world was, for a moment, simply small and luminous. There was a very human flurry: visitors, congratulations, the tiny bureaucracy of birth certificates and care. The baby was, in the hush of the hospital room, perfectly ordinary and perfectly miraculous. I held that small body and felt a kind of stitch being mended. I thought of Heloise and of the letters she left for me. I thought of the decisions that had been made for money and performance. I thought of the ways people could be both cruel and capable of change. As the months moved, the Pembrokes' legal troubles unfolded in fits and starts. There were convictions and settlements, fines and required oversight. Public apologies arrived and then were dissected. Some people retired quietly to estates and gardened in silence. Others faced courts. The effect was not a single wave of righteous vengeance but a long season of consequence. For families who had been harmed by the Foundation's misdirection, the fallout was messy and traumatic. For donors who had been deceived, it was a lesson in caution. The more substantial victory was the small, systemic shifts that reduced the likelihood that similar abuses would go unnoticed. The change was not spectacular, but it was effective. Organizations reformed, boards became more transparent, and the language of philanthropy was recalibrated. People began to demand evidence and not glossy images. That shift mattered because money, when it is accountable, can do enormous good. Personally, the months that followed were filled with the complex, ordinary work of parenting and the steady, mindful labor of public service. Our child learned the sounds of the neighborhood and the rhythms of late-night court filings. Elias and I developed routines that stitched together office hours and nap times. He learned to make oatmeal and to hold crying infants with a competence that made me laugh on exhausted mornings. We learned to talk about policy at the kitchen table and to read picture books at night. The two tasks did not cancel each other. They complemented one another. There were moments of tender reflection when I stood at the sink and watched the light through the window and thought about the arc my life had taken. Once I had been a girl who learned to fold herself into corners. Now I was someone who had learned to speak and to demand that systems do better. The change was not clean. It had cost sleep and privacy and sometimes joy. But it had also built law and refuge and the kind of trust that can be passed on to children. Friends and neighbors who supported us during the trial season became part of the broader work of the clinic. People who had given money now gave time. Volunteers who had once shied away from civic work now sat on panels and learned how to question budgets. The community that rose in response to our testimony was not shaped by spectacle but by a shared insistence that small lives be protected. There were also reconciliations of a private nature. Not all wounds heal, and not all estrangements end. But people changed. Some who had once been silent found their voices and apologized with a sincerity unlinked to press cycles. Others remained unmoved. The complicated truth about redemption is that it requires repair without expecting full restoration. You can apologize and you cannot always be forgiven. You can provide restitution and still carry the memory of harm. Those are realities that make civic honesty both necessary and hard. As the years folded, the institute that Elias and I founded, small at first and principled, grew into a place that combined legal aid with counseling and oversight training. We named a reading room after Heloise. We ran community panels and published guides for donors and for small nonprofits on how to create transparency. We worked, stubbornly and quietly, to make sure fewer children and families would have to learn what I had learned by accident and with great cost. When I returned, years later, to the old Pembroke house, it was no longer a monolith of unassailable reputation. The house stood, painted and pruned, but the performances that once defined the family had shifted into silence or into more private, modest acts of repair. The town had moved on. So had I. Walking past the house on a late afternoon, I thought of a child and a wooden box in an attic. I thought of small letters that hold enormous courage. I thought of a woman who had loved me enough to hide a key where only I could find it. I sat with Elias and our child on the porch of our Pale House, and we read a book about a brave little girl who saves the day in a small, improbable way. Our child laughed at the pictures and crawled into my lap, and I felt something like completion that was not the end of a story but the steady continuation of one. We taught our child, in small habitual ways, what family means. It meant being present when it is hard and being honest when mistakes are made. It meant defending people who cannot yet speak for themselves. It meant showing up with a kettle and listening to bad news and making it possible for other people to heal. The moral that lingered was not the simple one the tabloids wanted. It was not revenge or the satisfaction of exposure. It was a steadier thought. The truth, when it is spoken, changes systems. The act of naming wrongs is a civic duty. The practice of choosing love again and again, in small acts of ordinary courage, is how families heal and how communities grow more honest. There are nights when I fold Heloise's letters back into a shoebox and keep them where I can reach them. There are days when I work late and come home to find the kitchen a soft mess and the child asleep with a crayon in one hand. There are mornings when the inbox fills with requests for help from people who want to start a nonprofit and want to do it right. Those are the days that make the long season of hearings and subpoenas feel like a necessary prelude. Life, in its ordinary unfolding, taught me a final lesson I did not expect to learn in a courthouse. That power can be used to shield or to serve. That wealth offers choices, but choices must be stewarded with humility. That when someone returns to claim what was lost, the act is meaningful only if it is accompanied by an insistence on justice for others. Elias and I teach our child two things: to read critically and to look critically. We teach our child to ask why things are the way they are and to insist that systems that affect small people must have safeguards. We also teach the softer things: how to braid hair slowly, how to listen to friends who are sad, and how to make soup for people who need comfort. The Pembroke scandal became a civic moment in our town's history, and then it became a set of policies, and then, eventually, one of many stories about the cost of illusions. People forget quickly and forgive even more quickly. We set in motion reforms because we needed to protect future children, and in doing so we built a different kind of legacy than the Pembrokes had intended. We made accountability a public good. When I look back at the nights when I held a tray and felt the weight of being an exhibit, I see more than humiliation. I see a chain of small choices that led me here. Heloise's letters, a decision to record a conversation, a man who chose to look and then to stay, and a stubborn persistence to make the system bend toward good. The combination of those things was where change began. Sitting on the porch, my child asleep against my shoulder and Elias humming a quiet tune, I think of the small list of things that finally mattered: truth, presence, persistence, and the willingness to build systems that protect the vulnerable. Those things are not spectacular. They are the slow architecture of trust. I breathe in the night and feel contentment that is not a tidy triumph but a steady, earned warmth. The world is not fixed. It never will be. There will always be people who choose spectacle over substance and profit over people. But there are also people who will keep counting, investigating, and standing in small rooms making sure paperwork matches promises. That is how change actually happens. One file, one hearing, one child at a time. If you remember one thing from this story, let it be this: when someone tries to make you small, speak. When institutions hide their harm behind glamour, hold them accountable. When love returns, ask for partnership, not patronage. Build systems that protect the small. Keep the letters that make you remember who you were and choose, each day, who you want to be. The story does not end with a gavel. It ends with a lullaby and a small hand finding mine. It ends with the ordinary work of caring and with the knowledge that truth, when amplified by law and love, can make a difference. Comment below. What's the hardest lesson love has taught you? Subscribe for more stories about transformation, redemption, and the messy, beautiful work of becoming human.